Welcome, everyone, to another Lectern series. I'm here with somebody I have a tremendous amount of respect and affection for, from whom I have learned a lot, both from the caliber of his thought and the presence of his spirit, which is always exemplary. And some of you know him already. Zevi and I have done quite a few things together. And it's important to note that while this is a lectern series, this is also overlapping with my pilgrimage on the philosophical Silk Road, because the person we're going to be talking about, I think, is one of the best representatives on the philosophical Silk Road, living in Andalusia in the 11th century, birth date probably around 1020, 1021. It's all controversial, like everything scholastic always is. But representing one of the most innovative and influential, but often behind the scenes, intersections between Neoplatonism and Judaism that I've read. In my mind, he's as innovative and radical as Spinoza. And if you know me, that's high praise. So the person we're talking about, and forgive my pronunciation, I don't know Arabic. I apologize ahead of time. Okay, so Ibn Gabirol. So here's a bunch of books. Part of what we're going to talk about, Zevi and I, is that a lot of the more standard literature is suspect. I'm not talking about some weird conspiracy. There's good academic argument, and I'll point out one of the pivotal books around this, although this book makes some points around it, that a sort of standard reading of him has been a very significant misreading and a misleading away from what's really important and central. And it might have to do that certain terms, there's an important Arabic term, irada, which was translated into Latin as voluntas, which then was taken up by Augustinians, and that it gave it a very particular slant that really, I think, misrepresents him. But anyway, this is a good general introduction. It is not deep. This book is not deep. It is not deep, but it is not bad for just getting an overall. One of the nice advantages of this, you get a little bit of a look at his ethics, a look at his metaphysics, and you also get a good discussion of his poetry. Now, this is one of the interesting things about this guy. And also really, really important and powerful. He's as much a poet as he is a propositional philosopher. So, right? Although he's writing philosophical dialogues, and the fact that he's writing a dialogue is also important. We'll come back to that, right? But he's also writing some pretty famous poetry, and it's pretty good too, by the way. I mean, so the most important philosophical work, I've been told this is a fairly good translation, is The Fountain of Life. Now, one of the things I really like about this is his idea of God as an inexhaustible fount of intelligible realness. And you've probably heard me talk that way. And so when I saw him doing this, I went, oh, a brother in spirit. And so I really resonated with that. This is written in a dialogue, and I don't think that's coincidental, given especially a lot of the stuff I've been doing, the last couple of years about the inherently dialogical and imaginal nature of reason. And I've proposed being a reasonable person as a better role model than being a good logical computer. Here's a good selection of, the title gives it to you all. Selected religious poems of Solomon Ibn Gabirol, and there you go. Kind of thick, but that's okay because it's double paged. So for those of you who are lucky and privileged enough, I mean that in the good sense of the word, to be able to read Hebrew, you have the Hebrew version, and then you have the best English translation. Some of the translations are quite nice. I, of course, don't read Hebrew, so I can't tell if they're good. But the person who is translating them is trying to get something of the feel of a poem. Often there's rhythm and rhyme that really helps. Now, the book that is really pivotal for me, and I'm still making my way through it, I'm a little over halfway through it, is a book by Sarah Pessin. She's got a new book out, a new anthology. Well, she's in a new anthology that's coming out, and it's on the way. I'll have it before we do our next one of these. But this Ibn Gabirol's Theology of Desire. And I think the title says a lot. Matter and Method in Jewish Medieval Neoplatonism. So the fact that matter is coming, I mean, the traditional reading of Neoplatonism and Plotinus is matter is the least real and it is the locus of evil. And he is elevating matter to a very, very high standard. And that has important things to say. So that's just a bit of a background for those of you who want to dig into a figure that I'm sure to many of you was previously unknown. And part of what I want to do is bring him into awareness, bring him onto the philosophical Silk Road pilgrimage. And Zevi's here because there is clearly a tremendous apophatic mysticism also running through his work. And he's a Neoplatonist, so he is and you knew I had to say it at some point, a seeker of unity, the name of Zevi's channel. And Zevi's here because he can speak to something that I can't speak to, but I want to listen about, which is the degree to which we should think about the Jewish influence on Ibn Gabirol. He is Jewish. That's very clear in his poetry. It's, very quite clear in his poetry. Not so clear in The Fountain. In fact, for the longest time, The Fountain was misread as a Christian document. And so this brings up really interesting questions, like what's the relationship between poetry and philosophy in the cultivation of how are all these different influences, Greek, Neoplatonic, Arabic, Jewish history and philosophy impacting on him? There might be, right, we'll talk about this, a revival of a pre-Socratic thing, Empedocles, that's making an impact. There's just so much going on in this guy. And he's so influential in ways I have only just begun to learn about. So that's a bit of some broad context setting, why this guy's relevant, why he's important, why I'm excited about him, and why my good friend Zevi Slavin is here. So Zevi, say welcome and say a little bit about yourself and a little bit more about, some of the things that you're bringing to this, our joint venture here.
Well, firstly, John, thank you for having me here again. It's such a pleasure. And I look forward to every chance to be in dialogue with you. And your presence is a gift to participate in. And I'm really interested in these philosopher-mystics. That's really where my passion lies, both in the Jewish philosophical mystics and philosophical mystics from all traditions. I'm really interested in the seekers of unity historically, those that tried to connect and find a unified vision, a unified narrative for reality. And I'm really interested both in trying to think about that historically and contemporaneously. And I think the work that you're doing of trying to bring these historical thinkers to bear in today's modern world is work that I'm very partial to and very passionate about. And I think that I'm very glad that the universe brought us together for those purposes. And and I'm really interested in where all of this meets us today. How do we, and you are engaging right now on a journey of trying to literally embody these thinkers and these practices, moving physically through the space that these people occupied and going on a literal pilgrimage. And I'm very interested in that pilgrimage. The Neoplatonists are undertaking a metaphysical pilgrimage from the one to the many and from the many back to the one. And here we are on this pilgrimage. And I think it's so appropriate to be bringing Ibn Gabirol into this conversation. I was so glad when you mentioned him. A figure that's kind of been a hidden figure, both literally a hidden figure. As you said, his identity was obscured until 1846, until we figured out who the author of Fons Vitae, of the Fountain of Life, actually was. So really glad to be doing him the justice of bringing him back to the fore. And of talking about this beautiful tradition of Jewish Neoplatonism. And I think that's really important. I think sometimes we create these artificial structures of who is enlightened and who is not, which is kind of not a very enlightened thing to do. And sometimes it's like it's the groups. It's like it's just the just the Jews and Christians and the Muslims are unenlightened, or it's just the Muslims and Christians and the Jews are not enlightened. Like, we create all these silly binaries, or it's just the Abrahamic faiths and everyone else is primitive. And I think it's really important that we begin to see that no, we're all part of this emerging divine process, and to bring thinkers to the fore and to bring traditions to the fore, like Jewish Neoplatonism, that otherwise get excluded, and those exclusions create assumptions about who deserves to be at the table of enlightenment, when in reality we're all at that table together. And so it's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to my work is primarily here on YouTube. People can check it out, Seekers of Unity, and I'm basically just exploring the intersections of philosophy and mysticism historically, in ways that hopefully are meaningful and relevant to contemporary people in their real lived lives, and trying to create dialogue and education around that.
Excellent. So I thought we'd start with maybe initially, or when maybe this will be a lot of our first dialogue, the recovery of him from sort of the overlay. And even when he was sort of historically recovered, he was still misapprehended in some pretty deep ways. So two central concepts, and Pessin, she works very hard to go very carefully over the exegesis of this, is the notion of matter, and then an Arabic term, irada, that has traditionally been translated as will, but that has to do with the Latin translation being taken up by Augustinians that emphasize Augustine's notion of will, which, because of his battle with Pelagius, was a very tortured and convoluted thing. And sort of imposing that on him. And you may say, well, why do I care about any of that? And fair enough. But it brings up issues about how you see God as a creator. And so one of the ideas is that as a Neoplatonist, he seems to be engaging in, an idea of emanation and return, a very standard, although his take on it, we'll talk about the second thing in a minute, is non-standard. But then he was interpreted as invoking God having will, and this was taken to be a very voluntary notion, and therefore antagonistic or even contradictory to an idea of God as emanating, God as the one. Instead, God is an intentional agent that is making the world. Much more analogously, although this has problems, but the way we make an artifact, rather than the way I emanate my character or my personality. I take it that you hold that my character, my personality are a proper part of me, but they flow beyond me. And I can give 4 ecog psi for all that, but I'm trying to give the distinction. The way I emanate my character versus the way, somebody makes a table. Now, the second term, as I mentioned, so that's the first. Should we translate this Arabic term by the word will? And then it's bound up with this other, which is his really radically, and I've already hinted to it, revolutionary reconception of matter. Now, first of all, he doesn't mean matter in our modern sense, the stuff that is inert and resists us in objecting to us, objectivity. This is the ancient, largely Aristotelian Neoplatonic idea of matter as potentiality, that which is actualized by form, where form doesn't mean shape, it means structural, functional organization, something like that. Now, so in the standard, for example, as standard as you can get, Plotinus, God is the one is pure actuality, pure form. In fact, beyond form, the principle by which form emerges. And Zevi and I have talked about that, and Zevi's talked about that, so I won't go into that. And and then at the bottom, this emanates through progressively lesser and lesser degrees of realness, like the light from a fire moving into darkness and slowly diminishing, slowly attenuating, until you get to that aspect that is absolutely the least real, the least actualized, pure potentiality, lacking in form, lacking in intentionality, lacking in intelligibility, I should say, and therefore, according to Plotinus, absolute chaos and evil. It's that's what evil is. Now you get some innovations with Iamblichus and Proclus. They try to renovate matter a bit. And for me, that was where I was sort of holding on to them. It's like Neoplatonism doesn't have to be so, anti-materialistic. But that's nothing compared to Ibn Gabirol. He basically says something really powerful. And I want to slow down now. He says, matter is that which longs for form, which is like, just stop for a moment, right? That is just so like, see, so it goes immediately from a privative, negative, right, absence of form to this very positive, longing, desire for form, and so for Ibn Gabirol, this represents a fundamental way in which something like eros, love, is written into the fabric of reality. And he takes this to be one of the most powerful expressions of the essence of God, that God longs to bring things into form. So we can talk about whether or not that theologically lands or not. But notice the difference here. Notice the difference here. The idea that matter is this. So let me try and give something that may map or at least be analogous. We've come through a great sort of theoretical revolution in which complexity science, in which principles of self-organization and the emergence of dynamical systems have now become from being very marginal to being central and pervasive in our understanding of science, and is becoming more and more dominant. For me, and we have terms like attractors. Hear the term? Do you hear the term? An attractor is, something, so a dynamical system is going through various configurations, various ways in which its various variables are related, and you can track that. But that turns out, for very many of them, it's not random. It's going through this overall pattern, which is called an attractor. There's something about this. There's something about reality that is attracting dynamical systems to take a particular shape and a particular course. Now, I'm using those words very extended fashion, but think about that. Reality is somehow the word attract, right? I don't think it's coincidence historically, but I don't think it's a coincidence conceptually, right? There's something about reality that, right, makes things take on a particular shape and a particular course, and it's self-organizing. And there's a lot of literature, by the way, over here about the Neoplatonic conception of eros that is arguing more and more that eros corresponds to that drive for self-organization that expresses itself in the autopoiesis of living things, the way living things are self-making. Now, that means his view of matter is tying central pieces of mind and life back into matter, like what we have been taught since the scientific revolution to think of as what is most distant and opposite to mind. Now, that is exciting. What that leads to, and then I'll shut up because I'm talking a lot, but that leads to going back to the first thing, and this is what Pessin does. She says, look, another translation of the Arabic is not will, which is what you do in making, but desire, which fits perfectly with all this other stuff in Ibn Gabirol of that matter is the longing, the desire for form, and that doesn't have to be crudely anthropomorphic. I've given you a way of understanding it in terms of, what is it? There's something in reality that makes things self-organized to take a certain shape and a certain course and be attracted to certain patterns in the world. There, I've said it. And I think that's radically exciting because for me, that helps on a project that I've been engaged in, and some of you are taking some of my courses, like Seeing God Again for the First Time, of trying to get a post-Kantian, which also means a post-Newtonian, Neoplatonism. What does Neoplatonism look like after Kant and after Newton? And this is a powerful resource to tap into. So, sorry, I said a lot because I just find this like really powerful and really creative. A lot more here, but I want now you can talk for a long time, Zevi, and I'll try not to interrupt.
Not at all. No interruptions here. I don't think that's part of the discourse. Wow. So John, we're just jumping right in then.
Yeah. Well, that's what I like to do. Yeah.
I do wonder. I wonder like how familiar the listening audience is with the general outline of Ibn Gabirol and his thinking.
Sure.
And I'm titillated by the connections that you're drawing to a contemporary understanding of reality and sort of revitalizing Neoplatonism as a meaningful and explanatory schema for a contemporary way of conceptualizing the world that we live in. I wonder if it might be helpful to kind of step back a little and ground
please.
in Ibn Gabirol's larger space, and I think from there to kind of and you gestured already towards what is perhaps the two core radical moves that he's making in terms of his placing of matter to a place of privilege, and the ways that he does that is very beautiful in terms of and then the second one is his relationship to what has been translated will, and which you're correctly along many great scholars are trying to introduce different ways of thinking of that as eros, as desire, as ishq in the Arabic, or khifat in the Hebrew, as opposed to something like voluntas in the Latin. So that's important, and I think also importantly, and I don't want to gloss over this, is a point that you made that matter does not mean what we think in contemporary, in a contemporary Weltanschauung, it's the material of the world that we encounter, the objects of reality, but that matter is potentiality itself, and I almost wonder whether whether we should be sort of not using that word matter at all, and whether we should be using the word potential and actual instead of matter and form.
What do you think of her proposal? Sorry, I'm only interrupting because it's actually germane to the point. Well, two things. Don't think of everyday matter. Think of quantum potentiality. That's a closer analog in our scientific worldview. But secondly, she proposes elemental grounding principle as a language. But the reason I didn't use that is I think technically it's right, but it's not very
right.
So what do you think?
I mean, I have another suggestion, and I'm just thinking now with you, just about the language that we want to use for this discussion, is to perhaps use to not use an English word, but to go back to a Greek or Arabic or Hebrew word. So the word that he uses for matter is al-unsar, and the Greek word is hule, which is wood, which is literally wood, which is then matter. And hule is actually a very beautiful word because in the later Arabic and Jewish reusing of the Greek language, hule becomes synonymous with the potential. So in Jewish philosophy and in Kabbalah, koach ha'hule means the power of potential or potentiality. So I wonder whether something like hule is a better word to use than matter.
I think that's good. So everybody think about. Obviously, we don't mean wood as material stuff because then we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. What Zevi's pointing to is how it was taken up and refurbished and repurposed to how I can, from the same block of wood, I could make a table or a chair or a ship or a bunch of spears. And so it is equally the potential for all of those. And what makes it act as a chair, make it actually a chair, is the particular structural functional organization that is given to the wood by, say, like the carpenter or the sculptor. Is that fair, Zevi?
Yeah. And that thing which is being given to it is the morphe, is the shape.
Yes, yes.
Which is what, and the combination of those gives us the fancy name for his theory, which is universal hylomorphism. So it's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
combination of hylos and morphos, which for him pertain to all of reality besides for the essence of God.
yeah,
All of reality, including souls and including the first intellect, which is an innovation on Plotinus,
yep, very much.
or at least in the way that Plotinus has been understood. Um, so that's and I wonder now whether I'm helping at all for sort of an
No,
audience who doesn't.
this is good. Yeah, keep going,
um,
keep going.
so yeah, so number one is we have is like there's the basic Neoplatonic schema which most of us should be familiar with, which is that we have at the core of reality is the one, the good, God, and through a process of credential emanation, we come into the world, and that usually follows a particularly formalized schema, um, beginning with intellect, world, soul, world, and then individual entities of a reality. And as you're saying, John, what Ibn Gabirol is doing uniquely here is that, as opposed to the Neoplatonists, where that process is one of a further and further degradation and derivation and absence of the divine of the one, in Ibn Gabirol, because of what he does with this thing of matter, which we'll get into, this thing of Hule, there's this sort of backwards compatibility where Hule goes all the way up to God. And he uses some very beautiful Hebrew language here as well, where he calls the Hule, he calls it kavod, he calls it the glory of God, which is this
Oh,
strange
wow.
term that appears throughout the Bible and then is
Yeah,
picked up later by philosophers as like this strange thing, which this halo around the divine itself,
right.
which is like sort of the earliest, like you're saying, like the personality which emanates from us,
Yeah,
um, a term which I think also Spinoza picks up when he tries to denote, and the Kabbalists pick up certainly, kavod, the sense of something which is not quite the divine essence, but something which is emanating from the divine. And he
yeah,
also calls it the throne of God, which is this
yeah.
beautiful image of that upon which the divine sits, and it's hidden in the divine throne room. So when we think of matter, we're thinking of something which is very much not the Gnostic or the classic Neoplatonic sense, as you're saying, of
That's right.
evil, of privation, but we're thinking about something which is rich and deep and fundamentally divine and hidden, and potentiality itself, desiring form, desiring actuality, desiring manifestation. And in that process of manifestation, there's this paradox where we're both moving away, we're moving away from that raw potentiality, and in that sense, there is a distance from God, right? Or from the one, from the source of being. Another metaphor that Ibn Gabirol uses is the waters that flow from Eden, quoting the book of
Yeah,
Genesis, and the waters are those are flowing forth. And yet, as we move forward, we're getting more actualization and more so more manifestation of the shape
more
that
forms.
more
Yeah,
form that the
yeah. You're
desire is
getting
bringing
more and
into being.
more forms, both quantitatively and quantitatively. There's more
Correct.
formation happening. Yeah, go ahead.
Correct. Correct.
And more.
The
And
matter.
by the way, more information, more
Yes. Yes.
intelligibility because of
Yes.
that. Yes.
Yeah. The Hule wants to be informed, right,
Yes.
by
Yeah.
the shape that desire is leading it to, and that is it's taking form. And in that sense, there's this beautiful recession and
Yep.
procession from and to the one through this dual aspect theory of matter and form. And in that way, the relation to Spinoza that you mentioned earlier, I think, is an entirely appropriate one. And that whole process is generatively being powered by this erotic desire that is moving reality into being. Um,
And so a couple things that come out there that I find so exciting is, I mean, and this is something I thought I'd only seen in Erigena, which is I've always phenomenologically, and it's become more and more sort of clear to me, um, and and you can get this sort of by comparing Neoplatonism and Taoism or Zen, which is ultimate reality in terms of a kind of ultimacy. That and our the metaphor for that is up, right? We're oriented up and we're aspiring up and we're looking up. But you also have another notion of of ultimate reality, which is primordiality, that which grounds us and nourishes us. And of course, matter is related to mother, just the terms, I mean. And you see that in Taoism, and the emphasis, even a prioritization of the divine, or at least the sacred. Whether or not the Tao is divine I'm not going to argue about that, but it's clearly sacred and ultimately real. And there's an emphasis on the potentiality, on receptivity, on being like water, right? And he seems to be and what I saw in Erigena is both the primordiality and the ultimacy of God were being held together, rather than the traditional Neoplatonism, which was unidirectional, right? And it was like, oh, it's like this, it's almost like a magnet, right? And I see that in him, and through both of them, I see a Neoplatonism that is undermining a two worlds mythology profoundly, profoundly. Because you get a two worlds mythology if you could, by separating realness and goodness and everything all the way up here and negating it all the way down here. And that's how you get the profound. But if you hold this polarity of ultimacy and primordiality, of actuality and potentiality being equally real and equally homing the sacred, then the two worlds mythology is no longer viable. And that matters a lot to me. Because, as you know, I think the two worlds mythology has often been a driving force for various forms of nihilism or utopianism or nostalgia, all of which have been very dangerous. Does any of that track for you, or did I take us off
Absolutely.
course?
No, absolutely no. I think that's tracking very well. I think that's really a very poignant point here, which is that when we do talk about this thing of Thule, which is there as the very aura surrounding the immediate primal reality, the essence of being itself, it's also the Thule which makes up our being. Our
Yes.
bodies are comprised of matter and spirit, right?
Yes.
And in that sense, there is the ontological vertical gap that's created in some of these hierarchical, which then become these sort of two-world ontologies, is immediately collapsed, because there's this immediacy of the divine essence which emanates this
Yeah.
al-unsar al-al, this prime matter, or this grounding matter. I can't remember the term that Sarah Pessin wants to use instead. And the very matter.
Elemental grounding principle.
Yeah, the elemental grounding principle is also the elemental grounding principle of our flesh and bones,
Yes.
right? It's not a
Yeah.
different elemental grounding principle. It's the same Hule. There's that connectivity, and I think there's a really powerful direction there, and then to think of what is the relationship between that and form, not as two opposing hierarchical objects, right? Where it's like, which is great and which is what is this dance between them,
Yeah.
where potential is calling actual into being, and vice versa. I years ago I came across this line from Pierre de Chardin-Teilhard, the author of the Phenomenology of Man,
Yeah.
very fascinating Jesuit paleontologist and philosopher, and he writes, and it just came to me as I was rereading Ibn Gabirol in preparation for our discussion. Teilhard writes, "Son of man, bathe yourself in the ocean of matter, plunge into it where it's deepest and most violent, struggle in its currents and drink of its waters, for it cradled you long ago in your pre-conscious existence, and it is that ocean which will raise you up to God." I mean, these are Ibn Gabirol and Pierre de Chardin. These are two thinkers as distant, maybe as we can find, and yet this notion that there is a real call of this primacy and this depth of this, and there is a feminine aspect to it as well, of this great movement,
Yeah.
which we dive into, and we can, in a sense, there's what I see people like Teilhard doing is making a call to action, right?
Yeah.
Based on this very abstract metaphysic in a way that lends itself to realize the immediacy of it. So bathe yourself in the ocean of matter is not just like, let's think about Hule out there somewhere, but like you can actually enter into this ever-present Hule, which is the divine substance of our being.
That was beautifully said. I didn't make a connection to Desjardins. I made a connection to Whitehead, because Whitehead, I mean, people frequently, to my mind at least, miss that he's done something really radical in that the Platonic forms are principles of potential. They're potential. They're not principles of actuality, and that's why he has to put them inside an actual agent, or an actual mind, at least, of God. So God is actually, like, God's mind is made up of all of this eternal potential that he then has the job of actualizing into existence, which is this inversion of this a standard sort of Neoplatonic model, because I think White has the fundamental intuition that creativity requires both act and receptivity. In order to properly make sense of what creativity actually is. And for me, that again maps into Urero's work, where you have the bottom-up causation and the top-down constraints, which is again an inversion of the classic sort of Neoplatonic model. And so there's something going on here, to my mind, and he's prescient of it in a really important way. He's prescient. There's a realization, like I say, it's almost, notice what I'm doing. It's almost Taoist, which is the receptivity, the shaping of possibility is as real and necessary to existence as the actuality, the making things happen. And I find that really exciting and very interesting. I'm wondering what you mentioned that a moment ago, and I alluded to it too, with matter being related to mother. It sounds like we're at least touching on the idea, and maybe yang and yin is better than masculine and female, but he seems to be bringing a real feminine yin aspect into God that the West has had a really hard time acknowledging, because there's something it sees something deficient in receptivity. You're nodding, so please.
Yes. Yeah. I want to comment on that. I also want to add one more thinker, which I thought you might have mentioned, which is a friend and colleague of yours, Ian McGilchrist.
Oh, yes.
In his work, the Matter of Things, and I think in some ways, Ibn Gabirol is, as you're saying, sort of a background early sort of prophet for a lot of this direction that we're seeing in contemporary thinkers, from Whitehead to McGilchrist and others. And I'll let you speak more, because you're more acquainted with him as a colleague and interlocutor. Do you want to say a word about that relation before I respond to that comment?
So I mean, so Ian's idea is that the left hemisphere is basically in service of it should be in service of the right hemisphere, because the left hemisphere is about dealing in terms of, well, basically well-defined problems. You can bring a formal system to bear on it. You can pursue consistency. I'll use some Godelian language because I actually think it's appropriate. The right hemisphere is not worried as much about consistency because it's pursuing completeness. It's not trying to build things up from the features. It's trying to get the gestalt. And it doesn't have the ruthless self-confidence of the left hemisphere. That's what Ian emphasizes. The left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is very open and flexible, and to Ian's mind, much more receptive. His point is, we've had a domination of left hemispheric thinking, and our culture has reinforced and prioritized the left hemisphere at the expense of the right hemisphere, even though in many ways the right hemisphere should have priority in functioning. And one way of mapping that onto these things is people who are more dominantly left hemispheric tend to be more masculine, prototypically male, but there's also versions of this that apply to people that are not sort of biologically male. And so when one hypothesis, I'm talking very cautiously here, please, but one hypothesis is when we sort of sensing masculinity, we might, when we're sensing it in somebody's mindedness and not in their embodiedness, we're sensing a sort of a left hemispheric dominance or approach. Whereas when we're sensing something more feminine, even in somebody that might be biologically male, we're sensing a more right hemispheric presence. And then we've got the wrong ordering. We've got the emissary dominating the master as opposed to being in service. the left hemisphere should be in service of the right rather than the right in service of the left. And so we have to continue this and then turn it back to Zevi. We've tended to have a left hemispheric God, and we've tended to be really antagonistic towards right hemispheric gods or goddesses. Oh no! That's the mapping I think Zevi was pointing to. I'll bring in one more person before I put it back to him, which is the work of William Desmond, somebody who's having just a tremendous influence on me. And he talks about these two essentials, the essential conatus, but even more below that is the essential passivity, the essential receptivity. And he's trying to get that back into our model's so too weak of a word, our image. None of these work of God, but whatever. Go ahead, Zevi.
Right. Yeah, I think in terms of the question of the receptivity of matter in its relationship to form, there's something very rich going on here, and for me, it's particularly enriched by, and I want to be careful with this, by my lens understanding of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah.
Please.
And I want to be careful that I'm not reading Ibn Gabirol through the lens of Kabbalah. That would be a mistake, but refracted through my understanding of Kabbalah is perhaps the way that I'm wanting to understand
Good.
this, which is that for Ibn Gabirol, this potentiality, matter, hule, is this fundamental receptivity, and it's desiring to receive, we can say, from its partner, from form, and everything in existence is a product of the coupling, of the coming together of those two things, and they're brought together by this eros, by this desire. And the first thing which they produce, and which is radical, of course, for Ibn Gabirol, is intellect, is nous, and that relationship is very interesting in that in the Kabbalistic system you have the two divine parents, and they're literally called mother and father, Abba and Imma, Chachma and Bina, and it is in their case it is keter, which is also desire, which is will, which scholars debate how much that language is directly influenced by Ibn Gabirol, so I'll kind of leave that as an open question mark with a wink. Where it is will and desire which drives the first two great moments of intellect, which is the father and mother to come together and give birth to the next thing, which is the emotions in the Kabbalistic system. But in a sense here, there's also this coupling of form and matter, of receptivity and actuality, of feminine and masculine, into creating intellect, and then they couple again to create soul, and then again to create celestial body, and then again terrestrial body. And in all things, it's their coupling together that allows things to exist. Nothing exists without some sort of admixture, because everything is hulemorphe. It is both form and matter. It is both those things coming together. And there's a very interesting sort of point here in terms of how this desire, this irada is the Arabic that he uses, is both bringing together form and matter and mediating between the divine essence and this coupling of form and matter. In that, and Ibn Gabirol kind of goes back and forth, and it is not super clear exactly on this, but from my understanding, there's this mediating desire between form and matter that conjoins them, right? It is potential wanting to be actualized, desiring actualization, desiring form, the feminine desiring the masculine, to use that language, and then it's also desire which emerges them and emanates them from the essence. The essence also wants, and Sarah Pessin makes this point that within the divine essence there are kind of these two modes, as a mode of passivity and a mode of activity. And this is a distinction that we see amongst many Neoplatonists and even beyond Neoplatonism, of sort of this Deus aspiconditus and a Deus revelatius, of sort of a hidden God, a dark God, and a God of light. And in some senses, there's this hiddenness, the darkness, which is potential, and the light, which is form. And in that way, there's a mediation happening through desire, bringing form into existence, and desire also sometimes, in very evocative ways, Ibn Gabirol will use synonyms for irada, for desire, for will. He'll also call it wisdom, or he'll also call it
Yes.
word, right? He'll
Yeah.
call it word,
Logos. Yeah.
logos, right?
Yeah.
Which is evocative both of the Islamic tradition of God who speaks being into existence, of certainly the Jewish tradition where God speaks creation into existence, and Jewish mysticism where language is where language ontologically articulates reality into being. Divine speech brings reality constantly into being, and certainly also the Greek tradition. And in some ways, he's bringing this all together.
Yeah.
And the specific focus is that for him, logos is responsible for emanating, and I wonder where this lands for you, John. Logos specifically is responsible for emanating form, whereas the divine hiddenness, the essence, the passivity, is responsible for the direct, and I'm using this word now, emanation, or something drawing forth, bringing out of matter itself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that relationship was really interesting to me in the way that the two of them are coming down or emerging through those various channels, and sort of what all of this language is metaphor. And I think the role that a responsible reader of Neoplatonism is what does it mean to unpack these metaphors? And I'm curious to
Yeah.
throw that back to you.
Well, that's very opportune or appropriate. I'm preparing for a talk I'm going to give in Cambridge in September at the Logos conference. I gave a talk earlier this year at the Theosis conference. I'm going to be one at the Logos conference. Douglas Headley and Matthias are doing this amazing work together for Neoplatonism. Okay, so part of it is I want to start by noting what I said earlier, and now you've given a bit more explication or articulation. We can go back and perhaps recover it. Notice how the notion of self-organization will not be, you can't divide it into activity and passivity. A feedback cycle, is that active or receptive? It's like, well, it's both. And you can't separate it. And for me, I've got a huge argument for this paper, and I'm not going to try and do it now because that would just take us too far afield. But for me, right, the capacity to have regulated, where you have selective constraints. Here I'm doing Alicia Arrow, and enabling constraints. Do evolution. Here's natural selection. Here's variation, and then you have a feedback cycle of organisms reproducing. And then the feedback cycle, you've got variation and competition, and the feedback cycle doesn't merely repeat, it evolves. So it is inherently creative. Now, I see logos as the virtual engine, right? That is, but this is where maybe it's pressing on things a little bit. Maybe it's not lining up with him, because I see that as, right? Part of that is the virtual engine is the selective and enabling constraints. But when you look inside the feedback cycle, there's also bottom-up causation, right? So I think of logos as here's the virtual engine, the set of constraints, and what it's doing is it's regulating causal emergence so that it turns into feedback cycles in which receptivity and activity are indistinguishable. It functions by developing. It develops as functioning. It doesn't merely repeat. It evolves. Creativity and existence are bound up together inseparably. That's my attempt to try and answer what you just said using some cognitive scientific language that is becoming more and more pronounced in biology, cognitive science, and even in certain aspects of physics. The fact that it seems to be scale invariant, this is Michael Levin's work, you see these same principles and patterns at work, high-level cognition, biology, cellular biology, down into chemistry and physics, and up beyond the individual into super collectives. There's something that scale invariance like that points to I think it's good evidence to a fundamental ontological principle for reality as a whole. Why is it showing up so centrally and importantly at all of these different levels of analysis? So That is also my way of trying to bring into more current language the emanation and the emergence idea. We're talking about the relationship between these different levels and how you get like the lower level is the power, which is a potential word, right? And the upper level is basically the constraining for what's below it and so forth. But each level is simultaneously a power and a law. It's a law, it's a power for what's above it and a law that's below it. And that's pretty standard, actually, Neoplatonism, and applies very well. But what he's doing, which I think is right, is he's saying, but that means just like accept the consequences of that. The consequences of that is the bottom up from the primordiality is just as important. The return from the primordiality is just as sacred as the procession from the ultimacy. Did that track at all, or?
Yeah, totally. I want
to. I'm real. This is something I'm really wrestling with a lot. So I'm glad somebody as soon as you could track that. Good.
I want to tie that into. I think what you're doing, John, is really cutting edge and exciting and genuinely avant-garde in the direction. And I want to kind of tie that back into Ibn Gabirol's own language and sort of what he's doing in his work there, because I think it is an apt description of what's going on. You said earlier that Ibn Gabirol rewrites the book as a dialogue between a teacher and a student, which is interesting, and that dialogical element remains in the Latin translation and is lost in Ibn Falquere's abbreviated Hebrew translation. So that's very interesting, and you know, akin to Maimonides, who's writing teacher to student, also in a way there. But the whereas in the Maimonidean context, the student is having a crisis of faith, which prompts the epistle, namely the Guide for Perplexed Maimonides. In the case of Ibn Gabirol, the imagined student, presumably here, the question of the student is, what is the purpose of mankind? What are we here for? So it's a very pragmatic, so almost an ethical question in a real sense. And Ibn Gabirol's answer is that the purpose is to know who we are, what is our nature, and then accordingly we will know how to live, and we'll know our purpose. And in that, there's this combined sense of this knowledge which leads to action, to liberation, which is also very Spinozistic.
Very much.
He writes. He writes. I'll just read a few lines from here, because I think this very much ties into what you're saying, less on the sort of onto-metaphysical, but more so on the personal and the human level, which is the language that Ibn Gabirol himself is moving back and forth between. So the student asks, "What is the purpose of man or mankind?" And the teacher answers, "The inclination of their soul to the higher world, in order that everyone might return to their like, to that which they are, to their hule, to their prime hule." And he writes this in very Spinozistic language. He says that if you should lift yourself up to the first universal matter and are illuminated by its shadow, right? Matter and form, you will then, rather form and matter, you will then see the most wondrous of wonders. Devote yourself to this and be filled with love for it. This amor die, right, intellectual, since here lies the meaning for which the human soul exists, and here lies too amazing delight and uttermost happiness. And he talks about that in language of attaining immortality in that moment of, what we can call henosis or theosis. And there's a real sense in which, and he's playing into a very rich Jewish midrashic and later Kabbalistic and Zoharic concept, in which the ultimate end of creation already pre-exists creation, which is the perfection of the human soul, and here the human body as well, in its return to the ultimate stage. There's this language. There's a very strange, and this might seem like a bit of a tangent for a second, but I promise it's related.
You've suffered some of mine, so please go ahead.
there's a beautiful, so in the book of Genesis, God says, "Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmeinu," let us make mankind in our image. And all of the commentators, Jewish and otherwise, say, who is God why is God speaking in the plural here? Who is
Yeah.
God consulting with when God says, let us make mankind in our image? God is, for all of theology, the sole and single actor in all of creation, and we are created in solely God's image by solely God. And there are many beautiful answers posed within the Jewish tradition that God is speaking to heaven and earth, right? Let us make mankind in our image, heaven and earth. Matter and form, we can think of that. But there's a very beautiful midrashic answer, which is that God is consulting with the souls of the righteous, right? And which then leads to a question, which is that if the purpose of creation is to have these redeemed souls, these righteous souls, then why is God engaging the act of creation at all? If the object of God's desire is already present, with whom God can consult.
Right. Okay.
And the answer is a very beautiful one, which is that God is going through this process and consulting with that potentiality which God desires, in the hopes that, and I'll quote the Aramaic and then translate, liachzero tzadikim betushayo, to return the righteous in repentance, which means that there is this sense of perfection which pre-exists all of reality. God, in God's passive essential perfection, does not need anything from reality. That's, a cornerstone of theology and Neoplatonism as well. But there's something in the process of potential being manifest and coming into being, and being in that darkness and returning to the light, which returns to a greater unity, an ironically an imperfect perfection, which is somehow more beautiful than a perfect perfection. And I think what I'm hearing you getting at, and what I'm hearing Ibn Gabirol getting at, is that there is this desire-driven manifestation of multiplicity, right? Which is also part of the potentiality, is the potential for multiplicity into being, driven by the desire for it return to itself, but in a way that it now has gone through that procession.
Exactly.
And I wonder how that's fitting with your understanding.
Well, I mean, for me, the analogies, which is completely legitimate, fountain of life, right, are the, and notice what I said, analogies, but maybe also instantiations of of a biological organism. Um, think about it developing from the zygote. It is simultaneously differentiating and integrating. It is simultaneously, because if it doesn't differentiate, it will everything is just in the genetic code. It's all there. Some people say. There's a lot of dispute now about that in biology, but I'm only going to go with the standard model for the analogy, although I'm critical of it. But the process of complexification is simultaneously a process of integration and differentiation. The cells differentiate, but they also self-organize, literally self-organize into organs and into systems. And what you get is a complex system that is always complexifying, which then makes it better capable of conforming to a reality that is inherently complexifying in nature. And what that gives is, as something is complexifying, you get emergent functions. I can do things as a complex multicellular thing that I couldn't do as a zygote. I could have a conversation with this wonderful person, Zevi Slavin, and I've noticed that Zevi is never having these conversations with zygotes, with fertilized eggs, because they haven't complexified and they don't have the emergent functions. Think about my hand. Because it is simultaneously highly differentiated and highly integrated, that is why it can do so many things without falling apart or fragmenting itself. It is because that's what complexity is. Complexity isn't just being complicated. Complexity is exactly, can do many different things while also holding together well and maintaining itself together well. Now, that is a terrific enhancement of agency. But notice I can't cleanly separate out the differentiation. Again, I can't cleanly separate out the differentiation and the integration. They are completely interwoven together, and that's what gives my hand the actual power of creativity that it possesses. So to that, for me, that's exactly right. What he's saying, and one way of understanding what I'm saying about him, and maybe he's saying it too, is that if we pay very careful attention to life and also mind, we actually get some profound insights into the fundamental nature of reality itself. And that is a deeply personal and meaningful thing to say. Because if the warp and woof, the fabric, the grammar of my mind and of my body are are of a piece with that of reality, then my chances of being connected to what is most real are now greatly, significantly increased.
Yeah, I think there's an important point there, which is that for people like Ibn Gabirol and for basically all of the great philosophical mystics and certainly the Neoplatonic mystics, the thing which we are making inquiry into is both our individual being and the ground of being as such,
Excellent.
in one fell swoop, and the desire to understand that thing is precisely a desire to know who we really are, so that we may be and live in alignment with who we are. And there is a paradox there, and many philosophers have pointed to it, where we're always fundamentally aware of that in our hule, in our potentiality, in our hiddenness, in our shadow. Um, but it is about bringing that into being, and that itself is the journey which we are undergoing. That is the pilgrimage in which we undergo to inform our own potentiality, our own to bring more faith to our own hule, um, to bring what is the Arabic term that he uses, al-surah to al-unsar, of our
Yeah.
being, and I think there's something very real here, which is that it's not simply. I think so many times when we look at the Neoplatonists from the outside, we um, get lost in, or we lose them in thinking that they are just sort of armchair metaphysicians, thinking
Yeah.
about how many complex levels of mediation there are between the one and the many, and how many stages, um, and I think really what they're trying to do is they're trying to create language and narratives and images for the being which they are becoming,
Oh, well
and
said.
right. And I think when we read the Neoplatonists, and I so enjoyed both reading and listening to Sarah Pessin in preparation for this, which is that there's this real grappling with what do these terms actually point to, and what do
Yes.
they demand of us. What is this? And we get lost in these kind of cliche debates: emanation versus creation, will, no will, and thinking for a minute, like, what do these terms actually mean? And for me, John, what you're doing is you're grappling so deeply with what are these terms, what might they actually mean in a real contemporary um, cognitive sense, scientific sense, metaphysical sense, and in a way that pushes us towards being, towards being the type of being that we're aspiring to in these systems, um, and that's a demanding call, and one which I think for the Kabbalist, and again, I'm reading him refracted through the Kabbalist because that's the tradition which I was raised in.
Yeah.
Um, there's a deep need and desire for integration between that um, universe which fragments itself into this dual unity of potential and actual, and learning how to find those within ourselves, and to understand them, and to bring them into a generative, um, desirous, balanced, harmonious relationship. There's In some way you could read Ibn Gabirol as a cosmic couples therapist, and he's trying to therapize, he's trying to heal the coupling between potential and actual, between form and matter, between Hule and Morphe itself, within all of us, and within the divine as well. And within the divine is the theological side, which may be betraying my Kabbalistic side. But I think that's precisely the work that you're engaging in here, John.
Well, thank you. That is what I'm trying to do. Um, I think the next point I make it follows from these, but I may have to sort of do a little bit of filling in. Um, because as I keep trying to emphasize, right, with self-organizing things, autopoetic things, uh, even with information itself. Technical information theory. What is information? It's the ruling out of alternatives. What's an alternative? It's a possibility. What's ruling out? It's an action. Information is this inherently relational thing in which action and potentiality are deeply interwoven and interdefining at the very ground of the idea of that which makes it possible to make sense of reality. And so I'm going to just keep hammering on that. And what I like about him is him doing it so beautifully. I'm doing it rather clumsily in comparison to him. But what he's doing is he's getting us to challenge the fact that we want to dichotomize this. It seems natural to like, and I'm not trying to be harsh on us, but even the way we're doing it, like we've got all these dichotomies and we're trying to get us out. And I think he's trying to do something greater, which is no. Try to realize that the non-dichotomous is actually the way it is. And our impulse, I don't know what to call it, our cognitive impulse to dichotomize is what's getting in the way. Because I think that's very important. I can't go into it because taking off all the dichotomies that modernity has put us on, like the fact value, the subject object. I see him, which I've been trying to do, and other people like William Desmond and others, I see him as a great ally in this because, like I said, he's trying to get us to realize, no, if you pay really careful attention to mind and life and being, right, it's not that dichotomy at all. Now that leads to the point I want to make, which is I see him, he's not going to say what I'm saying, but I'm seeing him as laying the ground for potentially saying this. Because I see Erigena as laying the ground, but not wanting to say this, but sort of saying it. So there, as you know, there's a classic problem. It's a very classic problem, and it's where the metaphysics and the phenomenology or the cognition and the ontology start to get really blurred, which is what is the difference between the one, which is unintelligible, right, and doesn't fit into any system, and pure matter, which is unintelligible, non-categorical, and doesn't fit into any system, and is a no thing, and the one is a no thing, and you know, and quite rightly, I mean, and famously, Plotinus is like really wrestling with this, and the problem is, you need in Plotinus for them to be radically opposite, but you can't seem to point to any phenomenological difference between them. Anything in terms of thinkability or experienceability, how we could experience it or think it, that would distinguish the two of them from each other. And this, of course, this is kind of the dark skeleton in the Neoplatonic closet that's running through a lot of Neoplatonism. I mean, you see Iamblichus trying to wrestle with it, and other people. But I wonder if, and again, I'm not claiming he's saying this any more than I think Erigena is saying this, but is he actually saying, because John Vervaeke would say there's a, between the one, the ultimacy of the one and the primordiality of the Tao, there is actually the real one, God, if you want to put it that way. And if you start doing what we're talking about here, is there now any deep difference between the one and like I don't know what to call it, the elemental grounding principle, or that from which the Hule that can be understood emerges? Like, is there a difference? So that's very I remember I've emphasized he's not saying that. I'm being provocative now. I'm being provocative now.
Yeah, between that and the al-unsar al-awwal, we can use his Arabic, although we're probably both mispronouncing because neither of us speak Arabic.
That's right.
You know, it's interesting. I like you. I'm a seeker of unity, and I'm wanting to. I have a large personal and philosophical impulse to demolish the dichotomies and
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
find
Yeah.
how there's a fundamental unity to being. I think it's important to make a distinction between what we're wanting to read in Ibn Gabirol and what Ibn Gabirol himself might be saying and might be able to say and want to say.
And I did emphasize that. I
Yeah,
did
totally.
emphasize.
As you've correctly said, I remember having a conversation with a professor of Neoplatonism, um, living in Israel, Shalom Tzaddik, who's written on these Jewish Neoplatonists some magnificent works, and he was adamant that for all the Jewish Neoplatonists, even the most mystical and the most unitive, there's always a gap. There's always a distance between the one as such, between God and anything, even the Al Unsar Al Al, and for him, the Neoplatonists are very adamant about that, and I think that's true. The way that I've seen people like Sarah Pessin write about this, which for me is helpful. Also, I think in my desire to conflate something like Al Unsar Al Al with the one is also me being stuck in a dualistic way of thinking, where they're either two different things or they're united. And as someone who wants unity, I want to see them being united. And for me, I'm noticing that even that desire is a dualistic attempt. And I think the way that Sarah Pessin and others have helped me think is that the Al Unsar Al Al is analogous to the unknown essence of God,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
right, and
The hiddenness.
the hiddenness, exactly the
Yeah.
same way that God's hidden essence precedes and grounds the activity of God
The
in
shining.
things
Yeah.
like shining, like desire, like
Yeah.
later wisdom and the word, which itself is analogous. So too does the prime Hule um, pre, pre um, preempt and allow the potentiality of manifestation of being to come into being, so that it can become more and more informed. And I think of thinking of them as analogous to one another allows me to maintain something which I've gravitated more and more to, which is that in the apophasis of the Neoplatonists, the divine is a mystery, right?
Yeah.
And certainly uh, for us as well, the Al Unsar Al Al is mysterious as well. But there's an ultimate mystery which is um, synonymous with the divine, and all we can do is analogize to it. We
Of course.
cannot
Yeah.
give it any propositions or any characteristics or any characters. We cannot ascribe to it any of those things which we can and will ascribe to things that emerge from it. And even to say that things emerge from it is ready to say too much.
Yeah.
And I'm more comfortable these days with allowing the divine to remain a mystery and allowing us to reach into that mystery by way of analogy, but not by way of identification or
Yeah.
of labeling. And I think the work that he does with things like the word, the language that speaks forth from that is further deepening into that analogy, where the same way that in verbal speech we have voice itself, which is this potentiality for anything to be spoken. We have actual sounds, which is the forms
Yeah. Yeah.
of things, the shape that it takes, and then we have the meaning of the word, which is kind of the universal form of something which is now intelligible. We have the logos imparted in that. These I think the very way that Ibn Gabirol is using language as a metaphor. So he's saying that language itself is a metaphor for this thing which is reality. So do not take my words as reality; take them as metaphors. And I think his work of being a poet and philosopher, the poet is the
Yeah.
one who through his poesis is creating these imaginal worlds, and he's doing these magnificent, huge reconstructions of all of Judaism in his magnificent epic poems. And I think that philosophically, he's asking us to see himself as leaning into a play of language which is analogizing as opposed to identifying.
I think that's right. Uh, and I like you went to a point that I wanted to make, which is when you're trying to understand these two aspects of being, the phenomenon, the shining forth of intelligibility, and the mysterious, that which withdraws perpetually, and the horizon between them, which gives us a sense of inexhaustibility, the fountain. And so for me, that Whitehead talks about, that God isn't just the supreme actor; God is also the supreme sufferer. God can receive better than anything else, as well as act better than anything else. And I'm not saying that Gabirol is saying that, but I'm saying um, it's adjacent to what he's saying, as perhaps that. And for me, that seems to be a more, granted everything you said about this language being, I like Desmond's term, hyperbolic, thrown above. It's hyperbolic language. This hyperbolic language, and bring it back in a non-pejorative sense. Um, it's all hyperbolic, but that doesn't mean it's just mere hyperbole. Um, but given that hyperbole resonates more with the phenomenology of both my everyday experience and my most ecstatic experience. And that's what I find so powerful in him. He's giving a language that resonates with that, while also undermining the disastrous dichotomies of modernity, while also, undermining the two worlds mythology that, in some sense was burst by the axial revolutions, in all the problems associated with that. And I think that's just tremendously powerful. Now that leaves us with a couple things we still have to talk about, and so I'm gonna forestall them till our next two, which is one you brought up and you wanted to address, and I want to give it priority, which is, we've talked quite a bit about the Greek and Neoplatonic, and quite a bit about the Arabic, but you're issuing one that I wanted you to bring to the table, which is, yeah, but how can we see his Judaism and his being Jewish, like, showing up in his philosophy and his poetry? And then the second one is a topic that I think you just did some beautiful setting up for, and what you just said, which is the relationship between philosophy and poetry, because he's enacting a deep interpenetration of the two, that, of course, is very similar in some ways to Heidegger, and I think that's very interesting. So those are the two themes I would like to continue to explore with you. In what way should we see him as, or should we see him, is this the right framing, as, a Jewish philosopher? What does that mean? Above and beyond him being clearly Neoplatonic, clearly being influenced by the Andalusian, Islamic matrix that he's growing up in. But and is there something more? Because you've probably read more or seen more of her than I have, but I don't see the Jewish element playing a big part in what I've read so far. And I'm worried that there's a lacuna there. So that's how I'll leave that. And then the other one is this poetry and philosophy, because this has become and I would like to bring in a third P that I think is also running around implicit, and it gets mentioned a couple places, which is prophecy, not as horizontal telling of the future, but as trying to, I'll use some of the technical language from statistics, trying to get the large world, right, which is full of surprises, into our small world, which is full of consistencies. And prophecy is often the smashing down of that, to try and remind us in a profound way of how reality always exceeds our attempts to grasp it. And I think poetry and prophecy are doing this, and philosophy is trying to mediate between. I'm proposing to you that philosophy is mediating between poetry as poesis and prophecy, not as horizontal foretelling, but as vertical, like ingression, to use a Whiteheadian term, of a higher level, impressing itself in, making a difference to a lower level, and waking people up to that as they need to be woken up. So those are the two topics I propose we address. But I want to give you the last word on this, our current discussion. First, I want to thank you. This has been really rich and exciting. I want to thank you in particular because I often, not so much these days, especially after the philosophical Silk Road, but there's often a bit of loneliness, and your enthusiasm with how you took Ibn Gabirol up, and I could tell that he's really lighting things up for you too. I wanted to thank you for sharing that, and also for the many kind words you said about my work. I just wanted to take this moment to reciprocate, and how much high regard I have for the work you're doing. And very much the way you're trying to make this a living tradition for people and not just a historical curiosity. So my thanks. And then, yes. And any remember, we're not done the series, but any parting words for this episode that you like? Yeah.
Totally. Sure. Well, firstly, a reciprocation of that gratitude. It's you're making the journey of the alone to the alone less lonely.
Excellent. Oh, wow. That's like a tombstone line. That's great.
So the appreciation and friendship is mutual. And thank you for that, genuinely. There's a lot of directions. The direction of prophecy is actually a very rich one in the Jewish Andalusian tradition, specifically in reconceptualizing prophecy as getting into contact with the agent and active intellects. And so that's a theme which brings things together beautifully. I want to maybe end. I mean, there's so much to say. I want to end with maybe appropriately with you began by saying some of his dates, perhaps when he was born, and it's about less clear when he died. There's some legends also about how he died, right?
Yes.
And there's two kind of prime legends that circulate, and the fact that they're legends almost make them more apt for exploration. And I wanted to just end with a thought on one of them. So the one legend is that he was trampled to death by a horseman, which is a terrible way to go. The other legend is that he was put to death. He was killed by a rival poet who was jealous of his poetic capacities. And I mean, death and assassination. He loses one of his great patrons to a political assassination, so it's not unheard of. And the legend is that after he's assassinated by this competing poet, we imagine poets to be kind of docile.
Oh yeah,
and here we have poets murdering each other. He to dispose of Ibn Gabirol's body, his holy combination of form and matter in his person, he buries him under a fig tree, is the legend. And then in the preceding weeks, the tree begins to blossom in tremendous ways with fruit that were ever more fragrant and more sweet than they ever had been in the past. And people were curious about what had happened, what was going on. And in the process of their curiosity, they exhumed the body, and they find that he was killed, and they find the murderer, and he's brought to justice. And so it's a very kind of this very rich, but I'm not interested in that as a historical sort of cause of death kind of exploration, but I am interested in what that means poetically for us, metaphorically, in that in Ibn Gabirol's death and occultation, he was being lost to the Jewish tradition for hundreds of years. He's been buried somewhere. He's been lost.
Oh, yes.
But there is the potential for something sweet and beautiful and fruitful to blossom
beautiful, Zevi.
out of his body. And I think
yes.
I think that the kind of work that we're doing here, and many people that are engaging with his thought, is precisely that of taking the energy that he put into the earth and bringing forth something beautiful from it that will continue to give forth fruit and seeds, hopefully for many generations to come.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, my friend, and we will be talking again soon.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.